Our Dave, thanks. Postmarked by Election Day and received within 5 days is the standard for counting mail-in absentee ballots here in Mississippi. It's a relatively new timeline.
The U.S. Supreme Court affirmed today that the grace period is allowed. 3 on your side's Courtney Ann Jackson explains why it could still change in Mississippi.
Here's what Monday's ruling means for you. Mississippi can keep counting absentee ballots that are postmarked by Election Day, even if they arrive afterward, up to 5 days later. The Southern Poverty Law Center thinks that should stay in place.
And the importance of this decision is that there have been over the last several years attempts to restrict the number of people who can vote by restricting the time in which they can cast their ballot.
Mississippi was among the states that added that grace period during the pandemic to account for mail delays, but SPLC says it's a matter of access, pandemic or not.
A lot of things happen before Election Day, right? You can have a shift in policy or a shift in position by different candidates. And so people want to go all the way up to the day that they need to vote before making their final decision. And so it's important, and it really does hamstring people when you say receipt must happen before Election Day or on Election Day even.
But Governor Tate Reeves wants the legislature to tighten the deadline. And Senate Elections Chairman Senator Jeremy England notes that the Senate has approved reverting to the old timeline in recent years, but it didn't clear both chambers.
Fully expect us to have this law changed by the end of the 2027 legislative session at the latest.
England looks at it as an election integrity issue.
The longer we wait after Election Day for those ballots to be counted, the more people think something is happening. And even if there's no nefarious action going on, it's just that perception, and we can't have people losing their confidence in our election systems.
Secretary of State Michael Watson also says he opposes counting ballots that arrive after Election Day, but says the Supreme Court left that decision to states unless Congress changes federal law. Courtney Ann Jackson, 3 on your side.